folks. Welcome to another episode of Inside the Marble Palace, Saskatchewan Post Media's look at the Saskatchewan legislature and all political goings-on in this province. I'm Murray Mandrick, political columnist for the Regina Leader Post. Joining me, as always, Jeremy Symes, our legislative reporter for the Leader Post, and Phil Tank, I don't even know what to call you anymore. You work for the Star Phoenix, but congratulations, you have a new role in the digital world plus columnizing. Just describe that for a moment, Phil.
Digital opinion editor, and I hopefully will be writing more columns than my one a week that I have been writing. So
I hope so too, because Phil is a hell of a writer and a good columnist and a good journalist. And that's why I will start off with you first, Phil. The Athabasca by-election, which among startling developments that I've seen over my long gray-haired period of covering politics, this is certainly one. This is a seat that the Sask Party not only has never won, but nobody other than the Liberals and the NDP have ever won in its existence, and it roughly takes up a quarter of the province physically. Yet, surprisingly, amazingly, they won it and won it reasonably handily, notwithstanding a horrendously low voter turnout in a cold February day in northern Saskatchewan during the pandemic. But tell us about those results, Phil. They're quite startling.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll send you the money for saying that I'm a great writer. It's in the mail.
You are.
Maybe we can crowdsource it or crowdfund it. Yeah. Anyway, so let me address the turnout first of all. It's 24%, which is low, registered voters, which is low. But I looked at the turnout in 2020, and the voters that showed up last night are about 75% of what showed up in 2020 general election. So you can see that it's not that far off from, it's lower. All by-elections tend to result in lower turnouts, so it's not that far off. Jim LeMaig, who won for and I'm sure the NDP went into this with a lot of confidence. They're running Georgina Jolibois, who's a former MP and mayor of La Loche, definitely a better known name than Jim LeMaig for the Sask Party. Jim LeMaig got about 35 more votes than the Sask Party candidate got in the 2020 election when the NDP won. But the NDP got 700 fewer votes than they did in that election. And part of the issue here was that, the person who lost the NDP nomination, Darwin Roy, ran as an independent and, took about 7% of the vote, which is, a fair chunk for an independent to get. Wouldn't have made, if you add that onto Jolibois' margin, it still wouldn't have, Jim LeMaig still would have won. But you do wonder whether how much of that played a role.
Plus the loss in votes generally over the general election. It should be noted that Buckley Boulanger, while he has held this seat and won it by fantastic sums in the early days, the 56, I think, 0.8% he won in 2020 wasn't startling. It was a good, sizable 600 vote win, but maybe there was a little bit more susceptibility in this seat than we thought. Any guesses as to what the issue might have been, Phil? Because the premier was quick to tie it to the pandemic, and we'll get into that with Jeremy in a second because he just has stepped out of that press conference virtually. But what have you been hearing? What do you think might have been the issues in Athabasca that would cause such a historic change in this particular seat?
Well, it's difficult. To say, right? I mean, it's such a wide area. It's and it's suffered quite a bit under the pandemic. I mean, you'd think that, this summer, the Moes government said, when they took away all health restrictions, said, well, we'll put them back in if medical health officers ask for it. Well, the medical health officers up north did ask for restrictions and didn't get them until the rest of the province got them in September. So you would think that would have played in the NDP's favor. But, I mean, by-elections are strange. Like I say, it's a very, very large constituency. I know there's a new high school coming in La Loche that kind of never hurts. Basically it's difficult to say what. But like you say, it may have built on what was happening in the last election. That maybe the citizens here said, well, maybe we want representation in the government for a change. Maybe we should give that a try. So.
And even though it's not by any stretch of the imagination an affluent riding, it's one in which certain areas of the riding have people that are having good, solid jobs in the mining community, which probably reflects well in terms of the Sask Party policies and a few other things. So maybe we are seeing a bit of a changing face in the North, which I would think would be great news for Scott Moe and the Sask Party, and particularly great news to get an Indigenous candidate in this riding. And as Scott Moe, I think, pointed out at least one tweet, we now have MLAs from border to border to border, which is quite fascinating to me. Here's the thing that I don't get, though. At his press conference that you just sort of came from, where he talked about this, he didn't seem to me, and maybe this is just me, maybe you can get a better sense of it, Jeremy, but he didn't seem to me to be a premier celebrating a historic victory. He seemed to be wanting to make other points in relation to Ryan Miley and his relative unpopularity. This is certainly a high, tough blow for Ryan Miley to absorb right now, because this is one of the few safer seats that the NDP has, and their caucus is minuscule already. But can you just sort of describe the Premier's mood, what he was saying about Miley, and what he seemed to be messaging in the press conference that you just emerged from, Jeremy?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, not a great day for Ryan Miley. Obviously, this is considered a safe seat historically. So the Premier briefly mentioned, okay, yes, this is a historic moment for the Sask Party, and then he went in and right away laid into Ryan Miley and the NDP. Basically, what the Premier is saying is their rhetoric around calling these protesters we've seen at convoys as extremists has been divisive, according to the Premier, and that is turning voters away from the NDP. They're saying the Sask Party we're looking to unify people, and we've seen the Premier already give that message that lifting these mandates, all of that is an effort to unify people. And so I guess he's saying by Miley vilifying some of these protesters, that's why we are seeing the turnout that we saw yesterday in Athabasca. I will mention he did mention that the result may have also had to do with government policy as well. Like he mentioned the mining and forestry, he did mention that as well. And he was saying the investments in the schools and other investments up north may have also played a role in their victory. I'll just add too, he was asked, Jim LeMag, what's his role going to be in government? Will we see a cabinet position? That has not been specified yet, but he did mention that he will, he'll play a role of being a voice up north for those people who live there, who elected a government representative.
Which they sorely lacked. And to be quite frank, it would be really hard at some point or the other. I don't know if it's going to be the first cabinet shuffle we see after that's available, but it will be hard to leave your lone Indigenous and Northern member out of cabinet for Scott Moe right now. Tell me about the whole notion about the divisiveness, though, because, and I guess how Premier Scott Moe was articulating that view today, because there are those who are going to argue, and quite rightfully so, that it's pretty divisive to block borders that keep us from allowing us to have trade in this province, which we are totally dependent upon. Certainly the language and the rests and coots, in other words, the extremism is that we have seen out of that is what it is. I don't know if Ryan Miley is really calling anybody out when he's basically talking about a situation where we've seen 11 arrests and at least 4 of them for conspiracy to commit murder after the RCMP discover arms cache and body armor. How does Scott Moe separate those notions? I know he's always said that they're not all the protesters, but like how did he today separate the notion that we have seen behavior, not just in Coutts but elsewhere, that the Canadians aren't tolerating, don't want to tolerate, yet he's calling Ryan Miley and those who are criticizing the blockades is the ones who are extremists. I don't understand that, to be quite frank.
Yeah, for sure. I guess Moe is playing that fine line in a way of being sympathetic to, I guess, the general message of this protest being like, we're against COVID-19 mandates. You know, it's evident he is against it. We're seeing those restrictions lifting by the end of the month here. And I guess how he's played it is where he will call out or condemn those specific actions that, you know, that Miley has said are extreme, and that a lot of people agree are really extreme. But yeah, he plays this line where he'll condemn that and say, oh, well, everyone is not like that. You know, there's a lot of good people at these protests, that sort of thing. I did write a piece earlier this week that kind of touched on his change in messaging over the last little while, especially when it came to blockades. Originally, when he was asked about it, he said, well, I'm not going to tell these protesters what to do. A day later, we see Mo come out and go, well, you know what, I'm not for illegal activity, but continue to protest lawfully. And then we see a week later, please end these blockades, and still standing firm on his message of, I'm still sympathetic to the cause, guys, but please don't do some of these disruptive things. So yeah, it is interesting to see how he does play to these aspects of the protest, and yeah, try to message it across.
That was an interesting piece, and you got into how he had to walk back his initial comments on power and politics, in which he said that I'm not going to tell protesters what to do. And unfortunately, that was just days before the arrests were made. But as I think you're pointing out, Jeremy, he is speaking to at least two different groups and maybe more. And Phil, you also did a wonderful piece very recently, around last Saturday, I believe, on the Unified Grassroots and the role that it has played in terms of influencing Scott Moes' messaging overall, and maybe now influencing government policies, because it has been since October, December, when he was talking quite openly with Nadine Ness and Unified Grassroots, about what their concerns were, that we started to see that shift in Scott Moes' position. If you can you just sort of please outline for those listening out here what your story was about and how you see it not only playing into what's happened policy-wise, but what we're hearing and seeing in this very moment, where we're seeing Scott Moe talk about divisiveness and the need to get together, yet somehow basically talking directly to a group that, as your stories point out, don't all seem that all unifying to me.
Yeah, and that language of like stopping hate and division, that comes straight from them. That comes from what's written on their website. We want to stop the hate and division and coercion and discrimination, and all that's fine. But you know, the question, like I write in my column that's coming up tomorrow, is like, okay, if you're only about spreading unity and love, as you claim, why do you need to operate behind the walls of a private Facebook group? And of course, if you spend any time on there, we have some sources inside the group that have showed us that, yeah, I mean, there's lots of vaccine hesitancy. They've speculated about going to one of the, you know, to a platform where they can more freely spread misinformation. They of course don't call it that, but you know, that's certainly the gist you get there. Yeah. So anyway, this group formed in about September, and came out of nowhere for most people, and right away challenged at the end of the month, challenged the vaccine mandate that the province was coming in, and failed miserably at that, and had to pay court costs, everything. And you know, and that kind of raises a question too, like, where does the money for this group come from, especially then when, you know, they had just formed and suddenly they're challenging, they're seeking an injunction in court. So what my story showed is that since about October, and maybe before, and it indicates before, they've been undertaken a campaign to, you know, contact MLAs and sort of, you know, revising their tactics as they go on. Like, oh, well, don't send one email to every single MLA, send one email, or send an email to just your own MLA, and that sort of thing. It's very specific. And we also saw a push, and you know, and it's interesting that since they've been around, there have been no new public health restrictions, even though people were pushing for gathering restrictions. We were the only one of only two provinces that didn't have gathering restrictions at Thanksgiving. The only province to not introduce anything new for the Omicron wave, and in fact, you know, scale back a few things. And yeah, we saw a push at the beginning of the month from them to, like, because he hinted, okay, well, maybe these are coming to an end soon, and to make sure that he does end them. And again, when he announced the end, it's time to heal the divisions. Well, again, that's language straight from this group. So it's been, and there's nothing wrong, of course, with citizens banding together, but the more you read the comments on this site, you can tell these are to be as kind as I can, vaccine skeptics, and the fact that they are thinking about going to sites like Telegram and MeWe suggests that, and the fact that Facebook suspended them and has been censoring their private Facebook page, shows that they've been sharing some stuff that isn't mainstream, or is really anti-vaccine, despite the fact they say, oh no, we're not anti-vaccine at all, and they say they're going to keep at it too. They want to keep continuing to be a player in Saskatchewan, and maybe even wider than Saskatchewan.
Well, they clearly seem to, as your piece showed, they clearly have had influence on this provincial government. I don't think Scott Moe can deny this. Jeremy, how is this playing into the whole COVID thing? We're not getting information on COVID right now. We'll hopefully get an update on Thursday as to the most recent numbers, but we're not even getting things as basic as how many people have died since, I think, February 5th or 6th, last time I looked. Did Scott Moe have anything to say about COVID today, per se, in terms of how they're dealing with this? I know you guys did talk about the upcoming budget, but yeah, without PEOC and without other regular press conferences, do we really know what's going on right now in terms of how they're handling the pandemic, other than what we hear from Zach and a few other reporters about leaks in terms of how many how many are in hospitals? What did the Premier say about that today?
I know for sure. I guess Zach's our best resource right now.
Zach is our best resource right now.
In terms of knowing what's happening. Hospitalizations are up. We're seeing surgery issues right now, some delays in Yorkton and other areas of the province. He was asked about this today, and the Premier did acknowledge that they are seeing surgical issues right now, but it kind of stopped there, just at that, acknowledging that this is happening. He did mention that they're going to continue to invest more in healthcare and do more on the surgery stuff, which we've seen before. They have announced that. So that was his main message. It's just kind of acknowledging it, but again, no real sense of real concern, if that makes sense. Like, it didn't seem like this was a dire issue that we're facing in the province in terms of his tone. It was just kind of like, yeah, this is happening, and it's probably going to be happening for quite some time. Even after COVID, we're going to be seeing surgical issues, and we have a plan to deal with that. So that was my impression of how he responded.
So go ahead, Phil. Go ahead.
But back to the pressure from Unified Grassroots, the end of daily updates. As far as I know, there was nobody calling for that, right? I saw nothing on their Facebook pages that said this was something they were getting from them. That just seems to be a way for the government to cover things up. Like, we don't want you to know. I mean, hospitalizations from COVID are at an all-time high right now. Like, why do people of this province not have the right to know that? And I think the implications are wider, right? When you look at the Canadian map of COVID, we have a 0 on it because we haven't reported cases in a while. And how is it going to affect tourism down the road if we continue down here? Are you going to go to a jurisdiction where you know what the COVID cases are? Or are you going to go to one where you have no idea? Or are dealing, with all of our information being like a week late now, we could be in a much better spot than we were a week ago, and yet the most recent information we and people outside the province have is that, oh, look at how high hospitalizations are. I think it was a very clumsy idea of theirs, and I'm not sure it actually serves anyone very well.
Yeah, Scott Moe is going full bore in terms of his messaging and his policy track in terms of getting the border open when it's not being closed by protesters, and removing any BAX restrictions related to truckers and whatnot. As a matter of fact, I'm surprised they didn't lead with this in today's announcement, because it actually is pretty big news. But Premier Moe and Premier Kenney have joined U.S. governors in calling both the Prime Minister of this country and the President of the United States to remove these restrictions. What did he have to say about that today, Jeremy?
That was not brought up today at the press conference.
Yeah.
That letter came out after, but so he's part of this big letter saying, get rid of these, reinstate these exemptions so we can allow unvaccinated truckers to go across the border and deliver these goods. And they're calling on this from both President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau because they say North American trade is going to be impacted. We're going to see supply chain issues, which is so interesting because we had these blockades cause supply chain issues. So, but that is what they're calling for today in this letter.
There's an awful lot of fodder here for an opposition, Phil. I'll just end up off with you. But can Ryan Miley, under the circumstances of not being able to hold a safe seat like Athabasca, capitalize in the legislature or elsewhere right now under the circumstances of this? Because I think that losing a by-election to this, even though it is just one by-election, there's all kinds of circumstances as to why it may or may not happen. It's a body blow to Ryan Miley, and his leadership was already a little precarious.
Yeah, and I think there's people who look at well, I mean, I think we've seen some polls that suggest the NDP is gaining, particularly in the cities. So I mean, this by-election loss will come as a bit of a shock, I think, to NDP supporters and probably Sask Party supporters, and people who don't support either party. So I think it will certainly, there's always been people in the party who wonder whether he's the right person to lead it. I don't know that they have an obvious successor in mind, but who knows? As soon as you sense the leader might be on his way out or be vulnerable, that's when you sort of see people, coming out of the woodwork to replace them. But I mean, you think of the NDP has had 3 different leaders in the last 3 elections. That hasn't served them well. But there's, I'm sure, people wringing their hands in the party saying, "Oh, if we had a better leader, would we be doing better against Moe?" Because most people, opinion polls show most people don't support the blockades. I don't know how that breaks down in Saskatchewan, but opinion polls have shown us all sorts of different things about lifting restrictions and that sort of thing. And I think some of the questions in those polls have been poorly asked. They just said, "Do you want to get rid of restrictions?" People said, "Yeah," but I saw a more thoughtful one that said, "Do you think restrictions should be lifted if there's not a crush on hospitals?" And that one kind of got 2/3 support. So
yeah, the Leger poll was a little bit more interesting than the Angus Reid poll that I think you that really didn't tell you enough of anything. I wish we could go ahead.
I just want to add one thing.
Sure.
We just haven't heard, Ryan Miley hasn't said anything publicly today on Twitter or social media.
That's right.
So we're all kind of watching for his response today. We haven't heard anything yet. I also think it's interesting how the NDP did spend a lot of time up in that northern riding.
Good point,
right?
Yeah.
And it does kind of suggest, were they worried at all, and why did they spend so much time on what was considered a safe seat? So there are those questions too. But
yeah, and severe organizational questions. And who would have thought that this would be the week where we would be talking about Ryan Miley being in trouble as opposed to Scott Moe? And that's why politics is always so fascinating to me. I thank you both, Bill, Jeremy, for joining us on Inside the Marble Palace this week, and we'll hopefully catch up sometime soon. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. So once again, thanks, guys, and thanks for your insights.